By 1896, the National Sewing Machine Company employed nearly 1,400 workers on 20 acres in Belvidere, Illinois. They called it the second largest sewing machine factory in the world. Their cast iron machines sat in American parlors from coast to coast, sold through Macy's, Montgomery Ward, and Marshall Field, most of them wearing someone else's name. Then the market changed shape, a portable that couldn't match Singer's featherweight. Japanese imports that multiplied sevenfold in 4 years, a defensive merger in 1953 that bought time but not a future. That same year, the Belvidere plant went silent. The last building came down in 2021. What survives is a foundry ladle outside a county museum, and the machines, thousands of them, still sewing straight seams a century after the hands that built them went still. This is the story of how Barnabas Eldridge built an empire from a river town, how 60 years of fine workmanship wasn't enough when the world decided it wanted something lighter and cheaper, and how a factory that made things meant to last forever didn't last as long as the things it made. The story starts where the Kishwaukee meets the railroad in a northern Illinois river town that didn't yet know what it was about to become. Belvidere in the early 1880s was a county seat and not much more. A courthouse, a handful of merchants, farmland spreading flat in every direction. The kind of place where ambition went to sleep or moved on to Chicago. Good soil, good river. Not much reason for anyone beyond the county line to remember its name. Then a man named F.T. June showed up with a factory. June ran a sewing machine operation, and in 1886 he moved the whole thing to Belvidere. The reasons were practical. Rail access on the Galena and Chicago Union Line. Cheaper land than he'd find in any city east of the Mississippi. A river for power and process water, and a town hungry enough to welcome an industrialist with terms that made the relocation worth his trouble. Belvidere wanted industry the way a farmer wants rain, and June was offering it. Not as a promise, but as a physical fact. Crated machinery arriving by rail, construction crews breaking ground, jobs materializing in a place where the alternative was the plow or the counter of a general store. What June couldn't have known, what nobody in Belvidere could have predicted, was that his decision to relocate a single manufacturing concern to this quiet bend in the Kishwaukee would rewrite the town's identity for the next 7 decades. That a factory built to produce sewing machines would eventually sprawl across 20 acres, employ thousands, branch into bicycles and washing machines and automobiles and toys, and become so deeply embedded in the civic life of Boone County that Belvidere without national would be a sentence missing its verb. The plant went up fast. June Manufacturing wasn't building something delicate. These were cast iron sewing machines, heavy as anvils, engineered to outlast the families who bought them. The operation needed a foundry to pour the iron, a machine shop to finish it, a pattern shop to carve the wooden forms the molds were made from, and assembly space to put it all together. It needed men who could handle molten metal and women who could thread a bobbin mechanism with steady hands. And it needed them by the hundreds. Within a few years of June's arrival, Belvidere had something it had never had before. A factory whistle that told the town what time it was. Not the church bell. Not the courthouse clock. The whistle. That shift in authority, from civic time to industrial time, was the first sign of what Belvidere was becoming. June Manufacturing was building for the American parlor, but the work itself was industrial. Heavy, hot, physical. The foundry poured iron. The machine shop shook with the vibration of lathes cutting metal. And outside the factory walls, Belvidere started changing shape. Boarding houses went up for single men who'd come looking for work. A grocer expanded to serve the families forming around the plant. The saloon nearest the factory gate did its best business at shift change. None of this had existed before June's train pulled into the station. All of it grew because a man with a sewing machine factory decided this stretch of the Kishwaukee was the right place to build. But June's ambition, real as it was, would be dwarfed by what came next. Because in 1890, a man arrived who didn't just want to run a sewing machine company. He wanted to build an empire. His name was Barnabas Eldridge. Eldridge wasn't a tinkerer. He wasn't some garage inventor nursing a single patent and a dream. He was a consolidator, a man who looked at the American sewing machine industry in the late 19th century and saw not dozens of competing firms, but the raw material for something larger. and in 1890 he made his move. The sewing machine business in the 1880s was a brawl, Singer dominated. Wheeler and Wilson held ground. Dozens of smaller firms scattered across New England and the mid-Atlantic fought for whatever market share was left, many of them producing machines that looked suspiciously like each other, most of them destined to disappear within a generation. The industry's first explosive decade, the 1850s and 1860s, when the sewing machine transformed from curiosity to necessity, had created a gold rush of manufacturers. By the 1880s, the rush was over. What remained was a consolidation waiting to happen, and Eldridge intended to be the man holding the pieces when the dust settled. His instrument was the National Sewing Machine Company. In 1890, he consolidated June's Belvidere operation into National, folding the existing plant, its workforce, and its product line into a corporate structure with broader reach and deeper pockets than June alone could have managed. The Eldridge name didn't replace June's overnight. It grew around it. The June machines kept coming off the line, but now they carried a new ambition behind them. Not just to survive in the sewing machine market, but to dominate it from a base that most of the Eastern establishment hadn't taken seriously. What Eldridge understood, and what separated him from a dozen other ambitious men in the same industry, was that the sewing machine wasn't just a product. It was a piece of infrastructure. By the 1890s, American women weren't buying sewing machines as novelties or luxuries. They were buying them as tools, as fundamental to the running of a household as the stove or the wash tub. A reliable machine meant clothes for a family of 6, curtains for a new house, mending that didn't require a trip to the tailor and the expense that came with it. The machine sat at the center of domestic economy, and the company that could build one to last, really last, heavy enough to anchor a table, precise enough to hold a straight stitch through canvas, owned a piece of every household it entered. Eldridge built for that market. He poured money into the Belvidere foundry, expanded the machine shop, modernized the pattern shop, and began attracting engineering talent that no one expected to find in northern Illinois. One of the first was Horace Webster Hadley, who joined National in 1891 after a substantial inventive career at New Home Sewing Machine Company in Orange, Massachusetts. Hadley wasn't a minor figure. New Home was one of the established Eastern firms, a competitor with real patents, real prestige, and a reputation that commanded respect across the industry. Pulling Hadley west to Belvidere meant something. It meant National wasn't content to be a regional assembler stamping out copies of better men's designs. It meant the engineering center of gravity in the American sewing machine industry had just shifted, not to New York, not to Connecticut, but to a river town in Boone County, Illinois, a place most of Hadley's former colleagues probably couldn't have found on a map. Hadley brought the kind of knowledge that doesn't fit in a catalog. He understood needle bar geometry, bobbin case tolerances, the relationship between presser foot pressure and fabric feed that determines whether a machine sews or chews. And he brought connections, a network of suppliers, patent examiners, and fellow engineers who suddenly had a reason to pay attention to what was happening on the Kishwaukee. By 1894, National was already publishing trade literature substantial enough to catch the Smithsonian's attention. The catalogs presented the company not as a scrappy newcomer, but as an established concern. Machines displayed like fine furniture, cabinetry and finish emphasized alongside mechanical precision. The Eldridge name stamped on every model as a mark of quality that was meant to carry weight. It was branding before anyone called it that. Eldridge wasn't just selling machines. He was selling the idea that a Belvidere product belonged in the parlor of any respectable American home, that the cast iron heart of the thing had been poured and machined and finished with a care that the price alone couldn't convey. And the town noticed. Belvidere had been a courthouse town, a place you passed through on the way to somewhere bigger. Now it was becoming something else, a place where the factory payroll drove the grocer's inventory, where new houses went up within walking distance of the plant, where the rhythm of the town's days matched the rhythm of the shifts. When the morning whistle blew, Belvidere moved. When the evening whistle released them, the downtown filled. The relationship was that direct. The railroad that had drawn June to Belvidere now carried finished sewing machines east and west, and each crate that left the sidings carried the town's future with it. Eldridge had taken what June started and built something larger. Not just a factory, but an economic ecosystem where the company and the community drew from the same well. The Eldridge name appeared on the machines, on the catalogs, eventually on an automobile, but it might as well have appeared on the town itself. The relationship between National and Belvidere wasn't just economic, it was existential. When one grew, the other grew. They'd become the same thing, and neither one yet had any reason to imagine that arrangement wouldn't last. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. National didn't grow in one direction, it grew in all of them at once. That was Eldridge's genius. Or his gamble, depending on when you ask the question. The sewing machine business anchored everything, but Eldridge diversified early and aggressively. Bicycles came first, riding the 1890s cycling craze that swept the country like a fever. The same foundry that cast sewing machine beds could cast bicycle frames. The same machine shop that drilled needle plates could turn pedal cranks. National added bicycles to its line and sold them through the same retail channels that moved its sewing machines. It was diversification that made sense from the foundry floor up. Not a bet on a different industry, but an extension of what the Belvidere works already knew how to do. Then came washing machines, another cast iron, mechanically driven household device that leveraged the same manufacturing logic. Then, in 1903, something more ambitious, an automobile. The Eldridge Runabout was a brass-era car, built in the same Belvidere works that poured iron for sewing machines, assembled by workers who'd learned their trade on shuttle mechanisms and bobbin cases. It lasted only 3 years, until 1906, and it was never going to challenge Ford or Oldsmobile. But its existence tells you something about the confidence inside those walls. This was a company that believed its engineering could do anything. Pour it, machine it, assemble it, ship it. The specific product almost didn't matter. What mattered was the capability, the foundry, the machine shop, the skilled hands, the institutional knowledge of how to take raw iron and turn it into something a customer could use. Later came the Vindex line, cast iron toys that would become some of the most collectible American toy artifacts of the 20th century, miniature tractors, toy stoves, model cars, all produced in the same Belvidere foundry that cast sewing machine beds, using the same sand mold techniques and the same finishing processes. The Vindex name appeared on the toys, not the national name, but the iron was the same iron and the hands were the same hands. It was diversification that never left the building, and the capability was extraordinary. The Belvidere campus by the turn of the century sprawled across blocks, a riverfront industrial complex that sat in intimate relationship with the town's commercial center. The foundry handled the full cycle, pattern making, mold preparation, the pour, rough finishing, and fed castings to the machine shop where lathes and drill presses and grinding wheels turned rough iron into precision parts. A steam plant drove the works. Rail sidings connected the shipping department directly to the main line. The whole campus functioned as a single integrated organism, raw materials entering at one end and finished products leaving at the other. The river running alongside it all like a pulse. On the sewing machine side, still the core, still the business that paid the bills and justified the scale, National's engineers weren't standing still. The 1910 Rotary Model A introduced automatic thread tension, a feature that sounds minor until you've spent an afternoon fighting a bobbin that won't cooperate. Automatic tension meant a seamstress could switch from cotton to denim without stopping to adjust the machine, and it sold. It sold to individual buyers walking into hardware stores, and more importantly, it sold to the department stores that were becoming National's most powerful distribution channel. This was the quiet revolution inside National's rise. The private label business. Eldridge didn't just sell machines stamped with his own name. He sold them stamped with everyone else's. Macy's carried National-built machines with the Macy's label on the cabinet. Marshall Field did the same. Wanamaker's. Montgomery Ward. A housewife in Des Moines could buy what she thought was a Ward's sewing machine, take it home, sew her family's clothes on it for 30 years, and never once know that the iron was poured in Belvidere. The mechanism assembled on the Kishwaukee, the whole thing crated and shipped from Boone County, Illinois. National was the invisible backbone of the American domestic sewing machine market, present in millions of homes, recognized in almost none of them. The numbers told the scale of what that meant for Belvidere. By 1896, the company employed 1,378 workers in a town whose entire population couldn't have been much more than a few thousand. Local historians would claim it was the world's second largest sewing machine factory. Whether that ranking survives strict verification or not, the scale was undeniable. The campus eventually occupied more than 20 acres. 20 acres of foundry, machine shop, assembly floor, finishing department, shipping dock, and office space. A factory complex larger than some small towns, all of it anchored to a county seat that a decade and a half earlier had been unremarkable farmland with a courthouse. And the patents kept coming. Belvidere engineers, Hadley among them, filed improvements through the 1910s and 1920s, refining needle mechanisms, feed systems, motor mountings. The work was incremental in the way that real engineering usually is. No single patent changed the industry overnight. But taken together, they represented something important. A company that hadn't stopped thinking. A factory floor where the men cutting metal were also solving problems, figuring out how to make a machine stitch faster, last longer, tolerate thicker fabric without jamming. National survived the panic of 1893, survived the economic disruptions of the First World War, when supply chains tightened and raw material costs spiked. Survived the Depression, which killed companies far larger and better capitalized than a sewing machine maker in northern Illinois had any right to be. Each crisis that should have thinned the herd now, and did thin it, dozens of smaller competitors folding in each downturn, only proved how deeply National had rooted itself. The foundry kept pouring because Belvidere workers kept showing up. The machine shop kept cutting because the department stores kept ordering. And the department stores kept ordering because American women kept sewing. Through panics, through wars, through the worst economic collapse the country had ever seen. The sewing machine was not a luxury. It was how families made do. And National made the machines that made the making possible. By the 1930s, the engineers were integrating electric lights directly into the sewing head, patenting support structures for electrified machines that transformed what had been a foot-powered treadle device into something modern and illuminated. The 1935 reversed B could sew in both directions, forward and backward at the operator's command. It sounds simple now. In 1935, it was a genuine innovation, a feature competitors hadn't offered, and it came not from Singer's Manhattan offices or Wheeler and Wilson's Hartford works, but from Belvidere, Illinois, from the banks of the Kishwaukee, from a factory that had started as one man's relocation and become a town's reason for being. Step inside the Belvidere works on a weekday morning in the late 1930s, and the first thing you'd register wasn't sight, it was sound. The foundry ran hot and loud, the roar of the cupola furnace drawing air, the heavy clang of molds being set and struck, the hiss of molten iron meeting sand. Underneath that baseline, the steadier rhythm of the machine shop, lathes turning at speed, drill presses punching through cast iron, the whine of grinding wheels bringing rough surfaces to tolerance. The whole campus hummed at a frequency you felt in your chest before you processed it with your ears. That sound was the plant's heartbeat. It had been beating since 1886, and by the late 30s, it was so deeply woven into Belvidere's ambient noise that people who lived within earshot claimed they couldn't sleep when the factory shut down for holidays. The silence felt wrong. The process started with iron. Raw pig iron went into the cupola furnace, came out liquid at over 2,000 degrees, and poured into sand molds shaped by patterns the pattern shop had carved from hardwood. A single sewing machine bed, the cast iron body that holds the needle mechanism, the bobbin case, the feed dogs, the mounting points, required its own mold, its own pour, its own cooling time. Get the pour wrong, and you got a void in the casting, a crack along a stress line, a machine that would wobble on its first stitch and crack on its 100th. The foundry workers who handled those ladles, swinging crucibles of liquid iron through the air on overhead tracks, tipping them into molds with a precision that left no room for flinch, knew their craft the way a surgeon knows anatomy. The margin between a good pour and a ruined one was measured in seconds and degrees. One of those ladles survived. It sits today outside the Boone County Museum of History, a cast iron relic that once carried the stuff of sewing machines, bicycles, washing machines, and Vindex toys in liquid form. It may be the only ladle to escape the demolition of the national buildings in 1991, a single tool preserved from a process that once defined a town. From the foundry, the rough castings moved to the machine shop for finishing. This was where iron stopped being raw material and started becoming product. Surfaces were ground flat on milling machines. Mounting points were drilled to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Threads were cut, bores were reamed, and the Japanning department applied the glossy black lacquer finish that gave a national machine its distinctive look, layer after layer, baked on in ovens, rubbed down, baked again, polished until it caught the light like water on dark stone. A finished sewing machine head, ready for its cabinet, weighed enough to remind you it was made from the same material as bridge girders and locomotive wheels. That weight wasn't a flaw, it was the point. A national machine didn't vibrate, didn't walk across the table mid-seam. It sat where you put it like it intended to stay forever. The assembly floor brought the pieces together. The cast body from the foundry, the needle bar mechanism from the machine shop, the bobbin assembly, the hand wheel or electric motor, the tension system that Belvidere engineers had spent decades perfecting. Each machine moved through stations, each station adding a component, each worker performing a task they'd done so many times. The motion lived in their muscles more than their conscious minds. And by the end of that line, a collection of iron, steel, springs, and thread had become something a woman could sit down in front of, press her foot to the treadle, or flip the electric switch, and use to clothe her family. There was pride in that transformation, real pride. You could pour iron, and that was a skilled work. You could machine it to a 10,000th, and that was skilled work. But turning all of it into a device that put a straight, even seam through cotton or wool or denim, that was the trick. That was what National sold, and that was what Belvidere made. The smell of the place layered like the work itself. Foundry smoke first, metallic and faintly sulfurous. The smell of iron, remembering it used to be ore. Then machine oil, heavier and sweeter, coating every surface in the shop until the floors themselves became dark and slick with decades of it. Cutting fluid from the lathes, sharp enough to sting your nose from 20 feet. Lacquer from the Japanning ovens, an acrid sweetness that clung to your clothes and followed you home. And underneath all of it, the particular warmth of a building that had been running for half a century. Old wood, old brick, the accumulated heat of 10,000 shifts soaked into the walls and beams like memory stored in bone. Harold D. Neff worked those floors. His name appears in the company's engineering records, one of the men who translated Belvidere's foundry tradition into the mechanical precision the post-war market would demand. Men like Neff didn't just assemble machines. They understood them, why a particular cam profile produced a smoother stitch cycle, why one bearing alloy held its edge longer under sustained use, why the relationship between needle speed and fabric feed determined whether a seam held strong or puckered. That knowledge lived in their hands as much as in any blueprint, passed from senior man to apprentice the way farmers pass knowledge of soil, through proximity, repetition, and years. It's the kind of knowledge that can't be written down completely and can't be replaced by a manual. It walks out the gate on the last shift and doesn't come back. But in the late 1930s, nobody was thinking about last shifts. The Belvidere Works was the beating center of a town that had organized its entire economic life around this campus. The morning shift arrived on foot, most of them, walking the same streets their fathers had walked, passing the same houses the company's wages had built. The lunchtime whistle sent men streaming into the diners along State Street or into the plant cafeteria, where the coffee was strong and the conversation was about the work. The pour that went wrong, the order that was running late, the new jig someone had built to speed up a finishing operation. The evening whistle released them back into a town that existed, in the most fundamental sense, because the factory existed. Every dollar that moved through Belvidere's economy started at National's payroll window, and for over 50 years, the window had stayed open. The funny thing about National is that Belvidere became a household name without most households knowing it. That was the central paradox of the private label business, and it was a paradox that worked beautifully, right up until the moment it didn't. A woman in St. Louis buying a Montgomery Ward sewing machine wasn't thinking about Belvidere, Illinois. She was thinking about the ward's catalog, the price she'd circled with a pencil, the promise that the machine would arrive by rail in a wooden crate with assembly instructions and a warranty card inside. She didn't know her machine had been cast in a foundry on the Kishwaukee River, finished in a Japanning shop that smelled of lacquer and hot iron, and crated by workers who'd been doing exactly this since before she was born. Belvidere built the machine. Ward's got the customer's loyalty, and for decades that arrangement worked for everyone. National got volume. The department stores got product without the expense of building their own factories. The customer got a machine that would sew for 30 years without complaint. Everybody won. The volume was staggering. National didn't supply one department store. It supplied the biggest names in American retail: Macy's, Marshall Field, Wanamaker's, Montgomery Ward, each one stamping its own brand on a Belvidere machine. The same foundry poured iron for all of them. The same machinists drilled the same mounting holes. The same assembly workers fitted the same bobbin mechanisms with the same careful hands. The only thing that changed between a Macy's machine and a Ward's machine was the decal on the arm and the nameplate on the cabinet. National was the ghost in the American sewing room, present in millions of homes, recognized in almost none. Inside Belvidere, though, there was nothing invisible about it. The factory complex occupied roughly 5 blocks by the early 20th century, a riverfront campus that sat so close to downtown you could walk from the plant gate to the courthouse in 10 minutes. Workers didn't commute from distant suburbs or drive highways to industrial parks. They walked. Many of them lived within sight of the smokestacks. The plant was the town, and the town was the plant, and the money that moved from National's payroll window to the shops on State Street and back again was the circulation that kept the whole organism alive. Payday meant something in Belvidere the way it meant something in every factory town in America. It meant the grocer restocked his shelves, the barber stayed busy, the taverns filled on Friday nights with men whose hands were still dark with machine oil and cutting fluid, who ordered beers with the particular satisfaction of people who'd made something with weight that day. The bowling leagues were full. The churches were full. The schools were full of children who assumed, without anyone needing to say it, that the factory that employed their father would employ them too when the time came. That assumption, that the work would be there, that the gates would stay open, that making things in Belvidere was permanent, was the invisible infrastructure underneath everything else, more load-bearing than the foundry walls, and National made more than sewing machines. The Vindex line, cast iron toys produced in the same foundry, turned out miniature tractors, toy stoves, dollhouse furniture, all poured from the same iron and finished with the same care as the machines that paid the real bills. Vindex wasn't a separate company. It was a national product line, a sideline that used spare foundry capacity to make playthings for American children. A kid in 1930 could sit on the floor playing with a cast iron Vindex tractor while his mother sewed a dress on a machine that came from the same building. The same poor, the same workers. The scale of what National made for Belvidere is hard to overstate. The Boone County Museum still preserves a 1904 Eldridge runabout, that brass-era automobile built by a sewing machine company, as evidence of a time when a single Belvidere factory believed it could turn its hand to nearly anything and expect to succeed. By the time the company published its 1939 catalog, it had settled into a phrase that captured everything it wanted the world to believe about itself: 60 years of fine workmanship. The Smithsonian would later archive that catalog as an artifact of American trade literature, a period document that radiates the confidence of a company that had made things for 6 decades and fully expected to make them for 6 more. The machines in those pages gleamed. The cabinets were handsome. The features, automatic tension, reverse stitching, integrated electric lighting, were modern. And the language was the language of a concern that believed its own story, that workmanship mattered, that permanence had value, that a machine built to last was worth more than a machine built to sell. They were right about the machines. The machines were magnificent. What they couldn't see, standing at the summit of 60 years, looking out over a market they'd helped to build, was that the ground underneath them was already beginning to shift. In 1939, National's engineers unveiled an aluminum portable sewing machine. It was light, it was sleek, and it was aimed squarely at the market Singer had cracked open with its featherweight, the legendary Model 221, a machine so popular and so perfectly designed that Singer couldn't build them fast enough to meet demand. National looked at the featherweight and saw an opportunity. If Singer could sell portability, so could Belvidere. The aluminum portable was their answer. It should have worked. The engineering was competent. The concept was dead right. The American woman of 1939 was increasingly mobile, increasingly likely to want a machine she could carry to a sewing circle or store in a closet rather than a 100-pound cabinet piece rooted to the parlor floor. National's engineers understood the market shift. They built a machine to meet it, but the Singer featherweight had something National's aluminum portable didn't, a name the buyer trusted. Singer was Singer. It was the brand your mother used, the brand the department store clerk recommended, the brand that meant sewing machine the way Kleenex meant tissue. National, for all its manufacturing brilliance, was the company behind the name on someone else's machine. The private label model that had built National's volume had also built its anonymity. When National finally put its own name on a product that needed brand recognition to succeed, it discovered that 60 years of making other people's machines had left it without a public identity strong enough to carry the fight. The aluminum portable sold. It just didn't sell enough to reset National's position. It didn't become the product that made people say National the way they said Singer. It was a good machine that arrived in a market where good wasn't sufficient, where the name on the arm mattered as much as the mechanism inside it. And that quiet failure, barely noticed outside the industry, revealed something about where National stood at the end of the 1930s. The company was still innovating. The reversed B, with its forward and backward stitching, was a genuine technical advance. The patents filed in Belvidere for electric light integration showed real engineering ambition. The 1939 catalog radiated confidence. New models, new features, 60 years of proven craftsmanship presented as a guarantee of 60 more. Standing inside the Belvidere works that year, you'd have seen a factory at full stretch. The foundry pouring iron on schedule, the machine shop humming with precision work, the assembly floor delivering finished machines to the shipping dock, the railroad sidings stacked with crates bound for department stores from coast to coast. But the world was about to change in ways that Belvidere's foundry logic couldn't answer. Across the Pacific, Japan's industrial base was being rebuilt with an intensity and a focus on export markets that would, within a single decade, transform the global sewing machine industry from the inside out. Japanese production would leap from 134,000 machines in 1947 to more than 1 million by 1951, a seven-fold increase in 4 years, driven by manufacturers who were studying the American market with the same care Eldridge had once studied his Eastern competitors. And in the American living room, something subtler was shifting. The relationship between a woman and her sewing machine was beginning a slow evolution, from necessity to choice, from essential household infrastructure to a hobby, from something you needed to something you might want. The market National had been built to serve was changing shape, and the company's greatest strengths, the heavy iron, the foundry tradition, the 60 years of workmanship, were about to become, in the coldest possible accounting, liabilities. National, in 1939, was strong. Its machines were built to last generations. Its workforce was skilled and experienced. Its factory was a physical monument to American manufacturing at its most self-assured, 20 acres of capability, rooted to the banks of the Kishwaukee, connected by rail to every market that mattered. Everything about the company suggested permanence. That was the summit, the highest point. The view from the top of 60 years of fine workmanship, looking out over a landscape that was about to become unrecognizable. They just didn't know it yet. The war changed everything, but not all at once. When the fighting ended in 1945, the American sewing machine industry looked, on the surface, like it had looked before. Singer was still Singer. National was still shipping machines from Belvidere. The department stores were still ordering. The foundry was still pouring iron. If you'd walked the floor of the Belvidere Works in 1946, you'd have heard the same sounds, smelled the same layered mixture of machine oil and cutting fluid and lacquer, watched the same process, raw iron in, finished machines out. That had been running since Barnabas Eldridge consolidated the place in 1890. More than half a century of continuous operation. The rhythm hadn't broken. But the world outside the Kishwaukee had changed fundamentally, and the first sign was coming from the other side of the Pacific. Japan's post-war sewing machine industry didn't creep into existence. It erupted. In 1947, Japanese factories produced 134,000 sewing machines. 4 years later, in 1951, that number had passed 1 million, a seven-fold increase in 4 years. The scale of that acceleration is hard to overstate. Imagine the entire output of every American sewing machine maker in a given year. Then imagine a single foreign country matching and exceeding it in under half a decade, starting from near zero. These weren't knockoffs assembled in garages. These were machines produced by companies that were deliberately, systematically studying the American market and building products designed to enter it. Brother Industries was one of them. The company began exporting Japanese-made sewing machines in 1947. The same year, the industry's post-war production was still finding its footing. By 1950, Brothers' leadership had traveled to the United States to study the market firsthand, walking American retail floors, examining American machines, talking to American dealers, asking the questions that Belvidere should have been asking itself. What does the American buyer actually want? What would she pay? What would make her choose a Japanese machine over the one she already owned or trusted? What features mattered and what features were just weight? The answers were devastating for companies like National. The Japanese machines were lighter, they were cheaper, and they were, this is the part that mattered most and hurt most, genuinely good. Not crude imitations cobbled together from inferior materials. Good, functional, well-engineered sewing machines produced at a scale and a cost structure that the Belvidere foundry, with its sand molds, its cupola furnace, its 60-year-old workflow of iron pour machine finish assemble, simply could not match. The Japanese manufacturers had built new factories with new equipment organized around new production methods. National had a factory built in 1886 and expanded piecemeal over 6 decades. The comparison wasn't about skill or dedication or quality of craftsmanship. It was about the age of the tooling and the cost of the labor and the weight of the iron. National's machines weighed more because they were built from heavier castings. They cost more because the labor that poured and machined and finished those castings was American labor, paid American wages, working in a plant whose overhead, the buildings, the equipment, the pensions accumulating, the heating bills for a sprawling riverfront campus, had been growing since before the Spanish-American War. The weight that had once been the selling point, the heft, the permanence, the cast iron solidity that meant a national machine would outlast the table it sat on, was becoming, in the post-war market, a competitive disadvantage. Not because the quality had declined, it hadn't. Because the market had decided that what it wanted was lighter, cheaper, and good enough. And here was the deeper problem, the one that didn't show up in any single quarterly report, but was slowly hollowing out, National's competitive position from the inside. The private label model. For decades, National had built its business on volume through other people's brands. Macy's machines, Ward's machines, Marshall Field machines. The arrangement had been profitable. It had filled the Belvidere plant with orders and the town with paychecks. But it had also left National without the one thing it now desperately needed, a name that meant something to the American buyer when she stood in a store choosing between machines. Singer had that name. When Japanese machines appeared on American shelves, Singer had decades of brand equity to draw on, a name so synonymous with sewing that people used it as a generic noun. A woman who'd grown up watching her mother sew on a Singer had a reason to stay loyal, a reason to pay more, a reason to choose the familiar over the foreign. National had no such cushion. To the buying public, National was the company behind the name on someone else's machine. The Eldridge name carried weight among collectors and industry insiders, but not in the department store aisle where the purchase decision actually happened. When the competitive pressure arrived, carried on cargo ships from Yokohama and Osaka, priced to undercut, built to impress, National had nothing between itself and the wave except the quality of its iron and the skill of its workers. Neither one alone would be enough. The market was changing shape in another way too, quieter but equally damaging. The sewing machine's place in American domestic life was shifting. Through the Depression and the war, home sewing had been necessity. You sewed because you couldn't afford not to, because fabric was cheaper than finished clothes, because rationing meant making do, because a family of 5 needed a mother who could turn a bolt of cloth into something wearable. But post-war America was different. Incomes rose. Ready-made clothing became cheaper and more widely available in more sizes and more styles. The sewing machine was migrating, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, from tool to hobby, from essential household infrastructure to something you chose to use rather than something you had to. The total addressable market wasn't disappearing, but it was contracting at the exact moment that the supply of machines flooding into it was expanding. This was the vice that would crush companies like National. From one side, the demand for sewing machines was softening, not collapsing, but easing, especially at the price points where heavy, American-made cast iron machines competed. From the other side, the supply was surging, driven by Japanese manufacturers who could deliver acceptable quality at prices the Belvidere foundry couldn't approach. The squeeze didn't kill overnight. It applied pressure, steadily, quarter after quarter, and the companies caught in the middle had fewer good options with each passing year. National was especially vulnerable because its private label model gave it no place to hide. A company with a strong consumer brand can absorb price pressure by relying on loyalty, customers who will pay a premium because they trust the name. National had no such loyalty to draw on. Its customers were department stores, and department stores are loyal to their own margins, not to their suppliers. If Ward's could source a comparable machine from Japan for less money, Ward's would source a comparable machine from Japan for less money. That wasn't betrayal. That was retail. And National, having built its entire business around serving retail buyers rather than end consumers, had no defense against the arithmetic. National was built for a world that was ending. And the men running the company in Belvidere, whose names the public record has largely failed to preserve, were about to discover that 60 years of fine workmanship wouldn't buy them the time they needed to build for a different one. The decisions that killed National didn't arrive as a single catastrophe. They accumulated, one on top of another, each one defensible in the moment it was made, each one narrowing the road a little further until there was no road left. That's how industrial tragedies usually work. Not the sudden cliff, the long slope, taken one reasonable step at a time. The first decision wasn't really a decision at all. It was an inheritance. The accumulated weight of a business model that had been set in place decades earlier. National had built its entire distribution architecture around private label manufacturing, selling machines through department stores under other companies' names. That model had made Eldridge's fortune and filled the Belvidere works for the better part of half a century, but it had also created a dependency that functioned like a slow-acting poison. When the market tightened, National didn't have a consumer brand to defend. It had contracts, and contracts, unlike brands, can be renegotiated downward, can be shifted to a cheaper supplier, can be canceled with a letter and a handshake. A brand, a name that means something to the woman standing in the store with her hand on her pocketbook, is harder to kill. National had spent 60 years building manufacturing capability instead of consumer identity. The capability was extraordinary. The identity was almost invisible. And you can't build identity in a crisis. You needed it before the crisis arrived, and it's too late to start when the Japanese machines are already on the shelf. The second decision was the failure to find a post-war product that could reset the company's position in the market. National had tried. The aluminum portable of the late 1930s was a serious attempt to answer Singer's featherweight, to give National a branded flagship product that buyers would ask for by name rather than accept as someone else's label. It didn't work. The machine was competent but not compelling, and it arrived in a market where Singer's head start and brand recognition made competence insufficient. You had to be dramatically better or dramatically cheaper. National's portable was neither. After the war, with Japanese competition arriving and the domestic market shifting underneath them, National needed a breakout product more urgently than ever. Something that would make the name National matter to a buyer who'd never heard of Belvidere. Something that would give the sales team an answer when a department store buyer asked why they should keep ordering American iron when they could get comparable machines from Osaka at a fraction of the price. That product never came. Not because the engineers weren't capable. The machinists and toolmakers on the Belvidere floor knew how to build a sewing machine as well as anyone alive. The problem was structural. Innovation in a foundry-based manufacturing operation moves at the speed of tooling, and tooling moves slowly. Retooling a production line isn't a decision you make in a single quarter. It's a capital commitment that takes years to recoup, and it requires a company to bet on a specific direction at a moment when the direction itself was uncertain. Should National build lighter machines to compete with Japan on price? Should it build more sophisticated machines to compete on features? Should it abandon the private label model entirely and invest in consumer marketing? Each option required money the company was increasingly struggling to generate, time the market was increasingly unwilling to grant, and a willingness to risk the existing business, the contracts, the volume, the steady flow of orders that kept the foundry pouring and the payroll funded, on the hope that something new would work before the old way finished dying. And each option had a human cost that the strategy debates never fully captured. Retooling meant shutting down production lines while the new equipment went in. Shutting down lines meant laying off workers. Laying off workers in Belvidere didn't just mean unemployment checks and job searches. It meant families whose entire economic existence was built on the assumption that the plant would be there tomorrow. Mortgages taken out on factory wages. Kids enrolled in schools funded by factory taxes. A whole social infrastructure that depended on the foundry pouring and the paychecks flowing. The risk of doing nothing was slow decline. The risk of doing something was immediate disruption to the lives of people who had no say in the decision and no safety net if it went wrong. The safest choice, quarter by quarter, was to keep doing what National had always done. And quarter by quarter, the safest choice moved the company closer to the edge. That's the particular tragedy of incremental decline. Each individual decision looks reasonable. Each one can be defended with logic and data and the genuine desire not to make things worse for the people on the floor. The trajectory only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the slope, and by then the slope has become a cliff. The third decision, the one that carries a date, even if the individuals who signed the papers remain largely absent from the accessible public record, was the 1953 merger with Free Sewing Machine Company. The merger tells you everything you need to know about where National stood by the early 1950s. Companies merge from positions of strength when they're buying growth. Companies merge from positions of weakness when they're buying time. This was the second kind. Free Sewing Machine was not a powerhouse. It was another mid-tier American manufacturer squeezed by the same forces squeezing National, Japanese imports gaining shelf space month by month, shifting consumer preferences, shrinking the domestic market, the relentless arithmetic of a business where the price the customer would pay for a sewing machine was falling, while the cost of making one in an American foundry was not. The merger was a lifeboat. Two companies, each taking on water separately, lashing themselves together in the hope that the combined vessel might stay afloat longer than either one alone. What the merger couldn't fix was the thing that actually needed fixing. The problem wasn't that National was too small. The problem was that National's entire approach to making and selling sewing machines, the foundry process, the heavy castings, the private label distribution, the cost structure built on 60 years of accumulated overhead, was designed for a market that no longer existed in its previous form. Combining with Free didn't change the foundry process, didn't make the castings lighter, didn't build a consumer brand, didn't reduce the cost of American labor relative to Japanese labor. It addressed the symptoms with the tools of corporate finance while leaving the disease untouched. The logic wasn't insane. Combined, National and Free had broader product lines, theoretically larger distribution networks, and the possibility of eliminating redundant operations to reduce overhead. On paper, the merger made the kind of sense that defensive mergers always make on paper: synergies, efficiencies, the arithmetic of consolidation that sounds clean in a boardroom presentation and turns messy on a factory floor. But what the paper couldn't show was whether the fundamental problem was solvable by combination at all. Two companies that couldn't individually compete with Japanese imports on price weren't necessarily going to compete better together. The math of the merger addressed the cost structure. It didn't address the market, and the market was the problem. Somewhere in Belvidere, A worker heard about the merger and tried to figure out what it meant for him. Was his job safer now or less safe? Were the orders going to increase, or was eliminating redundant operations a polite way of saying that some of the people who walked through these gates every morning wouldn't be walking through them much longer? The men on the floor didn't need an MBA to understand the arithmetic. A merger between two struggling companies doesn't usually end with more jobs. It ends with fewer. The question was whose jobs and how soon, and whether the town that had built itself around this factory was about to discover what happened when the factory decided it needed fewer people than the town had raised to work there. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Japanese sewing machine industry continued to accelerate. Brother expanded its export operation. Other Japanese firms entered the American market with their own machines, their own price points, their own retail relationships. The machines kept getting better and kept getting cheaper, and they kept arriving in volumes that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The American sewing machine industry in the early 1950s was facing a version of what the American steel industry would face 20 years later, and the American auto industry 20 years after that. A reckoning with foreign competitors who had learned the game and were prepared to play it at a scale and a cost the incumbents couldn't match without fundamentally reinventing themselves. The fourth and final structural failure was the simplest to name and the hardest to overcome. National could not match the scale and price of Japanese production. This wasn't a failure of will or intelligence or dedication. It was economics. Japan's post-war sewing machine industry had been built from scratch with modern equipment, organized around modern production methods, and supported by a national industrial policy that actively encouraged export manufacturing. National's Belvidere works had been built in 1886 and expanded piecemeal over 6 decades. The foundry techniques were proven but not modern. The labor was skilled but expensive by global standards. The overhead was the accumulated weight of half a century of infrastructure: buildings, equipment, pensions, utility bills, maintenance on a riverfront campus that had been designed for an era when the American sewing machine market was a domestic contest among domestic producers. That era was over, and the cost of having built for it was now a burden that no merger, no product innovation, and no amount of fine workmanship could lift. The cruelest part was that the workers on the floor, the people whose livelihoods depended on the outcome of decisions made above them, were the last to feel the consequences and the first to bear them. An executive who made the wrong call could move on to another company, another industry, another town. A machinist whose skill was calibrated to a specific foundry, a specific set of tolerances, a specific way of making a specific thing in a specific place. That man had nowhere to go that wasn't down. His knowledge was local. His roots were local. His mortgage was local. And the decisions that were about to make all of that irrelevant were being made by people who would never have to live with the silence that followed. National didn't reinvent itself. It merged. It consolidated. It tried to survive by getting smaller efficiently rather than by getting different boldly. And each of those moves, defensible, rational, entirely understandable from the perspective of the people making them, was a step away from the factory floor in Belvidere, where the iron still poured and the machines still assembled and the workers still walked through the gates every morning as if the gates would always be there. In 1953, the Belvidere plant closed. There was no dramatic final scene that the public record preserved, no photograph of the last machine coming off the line, no account of a foreman hitting the stop button while the floor crew stood watching, no newspaper story about a union leader at the gate with a bullhorn, or a prayer vigil at the church down the street, or a town hall meeting where a politician promised that everything would be all right. If those moments happened, and they must have happened, because a factory that has run for 67 years doesn't stop without someone noticing, without someone standing on the floor when the machines went quiet for the last time. They weren't preserved in the sources that survived. The public record of National's end in Belvidere is a fact, not a story. The plant closed. The town's largest employer since 1886 ceased operations. That is what we know. What we can imagine, carefully, without inventing what isn't documented, is what that absence felt like. The foundry went cold. A cupola furnace that had burned for decades, that had been so constant a presence that the heat could be felt from the parking lot, stopped. The iron that had poured liquid and orange into molds every working day simply didn't pour. The sand sat in the mold boxes, dry and unused. The patterns on the pattern shop shelves, wooden forms carved to the shapes of sewing machine beds, bicycle parts, toy molds, had no purpose anymore. They were templates for things nobody was going to make. The machine shop went silent. The lathes stopped turning. The drill presses stopped punching. The grinding wheels that had filled the building with their high-pitched whine for longer than most workers had been alive wound down and stopped. The cutting fluid dried on the beds. The micrometers and gauges sat in their cases. The assembly lines stopped. The stations where workers had fitted needle bars and bobbin cases and tension mechanisms, performing the same motions so many thousands of times that muscle memory did the thinking. Those stations emptied. The last half-finished machines, if any remained, sat on the line like sentences that stopped mid-word. And the silence came, not gradually. Factories don't die by degrees. They run, and then they don't. The shift between those two states is absolute. One day there is sound, the baseline industrial roar that the town had absorbed into its own ambient noise, the sound that workers' families had stopped consciously hearing, the way you stop hearing a clock in your own house. The next day, nothing. A silence that had weight, that occupied space, that pressed against the walls of a building designed to contain noise, and now containing only its absence. The workers went home. They went home to houses built on factory wages, in a town shaped by factory money, carrying skills learned on a factory floor that no longer existed. The machinists who could hold a 10,000 tolerance, the foundry workers who could read a pour by color and viscosity, the Japanners who knew how many coats of lacquer and how many minutes in the oven, the assemblers who could thread a bobbin mechanism with their eyes closed. All of that knowledge, useless now. You can't pour iron in a town that no longer has a foundry. You can't machine castings for a company that no longer makes castings. The knowledge doesn't transfer to a retail counter or a loading dock. It sits in your hands, fluent in a language nobody speaks anymore. Some workers found other jobs. Belvidere wasn't the end of the world. Rockford was nearby, and Rockford still had manufacturing. Chicago was reachable. The interstate was coming. A man with mechanical skills could find work somewhere, probably, eventually, at some wage. But the somewhere wasn't Belvidere, and the wage wasn't what the factory had paid, and the work wasn't making something the way the old work had been making something. Taking raw iron and turning it into a machine that would sit in someone's home for 50 years. The pride of that specific craft didn't transfer. The paycheck might roughly eventually, but the pride didn't. The older workers had it worst. A man who'd spent 30 years in the foundry, whose body knew the weight of a ladle and the color of a good pour the way a musician knows pitch, was not easily retrained for a different industry at 50. His skills were deep but narrow, deep enough to have defined his working life, narrow enough to be useless anywhere but a foundry that was no longer operating. Some of these men never found work that matched what they'd had. They took what was available, they adjusted. They didn't talk about it much because men of that generation in that place didn't talk about loss the way later generations would learn to. They carried it quietly, the way they'd carried the iron, as weight, borne without comment, because that was what you did. The town felt the closure the way a body feels an amputation. Not just the immediate pain, but the phantom sensation afterward. The economy still structured around a factory that wasn't there. The rhythms of the day still organized around shift changes that didn't happen. The social infrastructure of bowling leagues and church suppers and Friday night tavern visits slowly thinning as the money that had sustained them dried up. Belvidere didn't die. It's important to say that clearly. The town didn't disappear. People stayed. People adapted. Life continued, the way life continues in every American town that loses its largest employer, not dramatically, not with a single decisive break, but with a slow recalibration of expectations, a gradual acceptance that the place you live in is no longer the place it used to be. The corporate entity survived the Belvidere closure. National as a company name persisted in some form until approximately 1957, 4 years after the plant that had given the name its meaning shut its doors. The distinction matters, but not in the way a corporate historian might think. For Belvidere, the company's afterlife was irrelevant. Whatever National did between 1953 and 1957, it didn't do it on the banks of the Kishwaukee. It didn't do it with Belvidere workers. It didn't do it in the foundry where the iron had poured, or the machine shop where the castings had been finished. The town's story and the company's story, which had been the same story since 1886, diverged in 1953 and never reconnected. In 1960, the new home brand, which had been part of National's corporate lineage, a name that reached back to the Eastern sewing machine industry where Horace Webster Hadley had learned his trade before heading west to Belvidere in 1891, was purchased by Janome, a Japanese company. The symmetry was almost too precise to bear. The nation whose sewing machine exports had helped squeeze the American manufacturers out of their own market now owned one of their names. The new home brand would survive. Janome would build it into a global presence. The name would appear on machines sold in countries Barnabas Eldridge never shipped to. But the name would have nothing to do with Belvidere, nothing to do with the Kishwaukee, nothing to do with the foundry ladle, or the Japanning shop, or the workers who'd walked those floors. The brand survived. The machines survived. Thousands of National sewing machines are still in use or in collections today, still capable of sewing a straight seam a century after they were cast and assembled in Boone County. The iron holds. The mechanism turns. The thing does what it was built to do. But the company that built them, the plant that made them, the town that depended on them, those didn't survive the way the machines did. The iron lasted longer than the enterprise that shaped it. The product outlasted everything except the memory of how it was made. After National, the buildings found other uses the way abandoned industrial buildings always do. Grudgingly, partially, with the slow indignity of a structure designed for one purpose being pressed into service for something smaller. The transition wasn't immediate. A factory campus that has operated for 6 decades doesn't convert to new use overnight. There are environmental concerns. Decades of foundry work leave their mark in the soil. There are ownership questions, maintenance costs, the basic problem of finding someone willing to take on a building designed to house a cupola furnace and a 100-ton overhead crane and repurpose it for something the modern economy actually wants. Most of the campus simply sat. The buildings deteriorating at the speed. Buildings deteriorate when nobody maintains them. A slow leak here, a broken window there, weeds pushing through the loading dock, the particular neglect that comes when a building stops being someone's responsibility and becomes everyone's problem. Leith furniture eventually moved into part of the surviving complex. For decades, what had been a sewing machine factory became a furniture showroom. The foundry floor where workers had poured molten iron at 2,000 degrees became a place where couples browsed sofas. The machine shop where Hadley and Neff had drilled mounting holes to thousandths of an inch became warehouse space stacked with dining room sets and bedroom suites. The conversion was thorough enough to erase the building's original purpose from casual view. A customer shopping for a recliner wouldn't have known she was standing where a cupola furnace once burned. But the bones were still there underneath. The heavy timber, the thick brick walls, the massive floor plates designed to carry the weight of industrial machinery, not armchairs. Buildings remember what they were built for, even when the work stops. Other parts of the complex fared worse. The campus, that had once occupied 5 blocks and more than 20 acres, was dismantled piece by piece over the decades. Buildings were torn down as they became too expensive to maintain. Their materials salvaged or hauled to landfills, the footprint of National's empire shrinking like a stain fading in the sun. In 1991, a major demolition took down several of the remaining National structures, and with them went most of the physical evidence that a significant American manufacturer had once operated on this ground. The foundry ladle that sits today outside the Boone County Museum of History may be the only piece of foundry equipment to escape that demolition. A single cast iron tool, pulled from the wreckage, preserved as artifact when everything around it was destroyed. It once carried liquid iron. Now it carries memory. That's a different kind of weight, but it's weight nonetheless. The last substantial remnant of the National complex held on longer than anyone might have expected. By 2017, the city of Belvidere owned an approximately 40,000 square foot building, the final surviving shell of what had once been Boone County's largest industrial campus. City officials tried to find it a future. There was talk of a hotel development. The location had appeal. Near downtown, near the river, with the kind of old brick industrial character that developers in other cities had turned into boutique hotels and mixed-use spaces. But the building's condition told a bleaker story. The roof leaked, the mechanical systems were shot, environmental remediation was likely necessary. Consultants estimated demolition alone would cost approximately $1 million, and renovation would cost many times that. The math didn't work. It rarely does with buildings like these. The cost of saving what's left almost always exceeds what anyone is willing to pay for the privilege of having saved it. The final remnant came down in 2021, 135 years after F.T. June moved his sewing machine operation to a bend in the Kishwaukee River. The last physical trace of what he'd started was reduced to rubble and carted away. Belvidere's long industrial afterlife, the decades of secondary use, the gradual demolitions, the periodic hopes that someone would find a way to save the last building, was over. What had taken 67 years to build and another 68 to fully erase was finally completely gone. What remains is smaller, the foundry ladle outside the museum, the Eldridge runabout inside it, still polished, still on display, still proof that a sewing machine company once had the confidence to build a car, a historical marker connecting the artifacts to the factory that made them, and the stories, thinner now, carried by fewer people each year, the first-hand accounts fading into second-hand memory, the way all living history eventually does. A foundry ladle is a simple tool, a heavy vessel, open at the top, designed for one purpose, to carry liquid iron from the furnace to the mold. It has no moving parts, no precision mechanism, no engineering elegance. It is, if you want to be ungenerous about it, a bucket for metal that has been heated past the point of recognition. Its only virtues are that it holds the pour and survives the heat. The ladle outside the Boone County Museum of History did both of those things for decades. It carried the iron that became sewing machines, bicycles, washing machine tubs, toy tractors, and parts for an automobile that a sewing machine company had the audacity to build. It carried the raw material of Belvidere's economic life from furnace to mold, pour after pour, shift after shift, year after year, until the furnace went cold and the molds were broken up, and the building that housed them came down around it. Now it sits in the open air, close to the river, not far from where the factory once stood. Inside the museum, the Eldridge runabout waits, polished, preserved, a brass-era curiosity from the years when National's confidence was wide enough to include automobiles. Visitors learn that a sewing machine company in Belvidere, Illinois, once built a car, and they carry that fact home as a piece of American strangeness worth repeating. What they may not carry is the rest of it, the foundry workers and the machinists, the Japaners and the assemblers, the engineers who filed patents from a river town most of the country had never heard of, the women at department store counters who sold Belvidere machines without ever saying the word Belvidere, the families who assumed the gates would always be open, the morning whistles, the Friday paychecks, the particular weight of a cast iron sewing machine in a woman's hands. The machines are still out there, thousands of them, in antique shops and estate sales, in the sewing rooms of quilt guilds, in attics where they've sat untouched for decades. A National sewing machine from 1910 will still sew a straight seam if you oil it and thread it right. The iron holds, the mechanism turns, the bobbin catches. The thing does what it was built to do. 100 years and more after the hands that built it went still. They are, by any measure, magnificent machines. They were always magnificent machines. That was never the problem. The company didn't survive. The buildings didn't survive. The name passed to Janome and lives on in a corporate lineage that has nothing to do with the Kishwaukee, nothing to do with Boone County, nothing to do with the smell of molten iron on a Tuesday morning in 1938. The town survives. Belvidere is still there, still a county seat, still on the river, still connected to the railroad that once carried crated sewing machines to every corner of the country. People still live there and work there and raise children there. But the factory that made the town's name recognizable beyond the county line, the 20 acres of foundry and machine shop and assembly floor, the employer that paid the wages, that built the houses, that filled the schools, that made Belvidere a place, and not just a dot on a map, exists now only in the museum and in the stories, and in a single cast iron ladle sitting in the open air, where the sound of the factory used to be.